Okay, well, our speaker today is Richard Norman, and I'm extremely grateful that he and his wife Leslie have come all the way, well, I believe they've come all the way from Kent today to be with us, which is fantastic. In these days of Zoom, it's so easy for speakers to say, I'll just appear on a screen, without leaving their home, but they've come all the way on the train for us to be with us today. Richard's last visit to us was in 2012. So it is long overdue, Richard, but thank you very much for coming back. Richard is Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Kent. He wrote the book On Humanism, which was published 10 years ago, and that's available in our library. He's also the co-author with Andrew Copson and Luke Donnellan of a new book called Understanding Humanism, which was published last year by Routledge. I've just read it and it's very good. There will be a copy of it in our library. I've got a copy of it in my case over there. I'm going to ask Richard to sign it. The book on humanism, I just looked up the book on humanism, the one that Richard wrote 10 years ago. I looked it up on Amazon yesterday, and you can get a hard copy of it for £105 on Amazon.
Is that for the signature?
Well, you see, so my plan really is to get Richard to sign a copy of Understanding Humanism, or maybe the other copy as well, and then we'll just flog them on eBay, or on Amazon even. No, don't know why it's so expensive, but you can get.
I don't know why.
You can get.
I wouldn't pay that.
You're not getting any sort of benefit from that. You can get the paperbacks more cheaply.
Yes.
Richard is also a patron of Humanists UK. He's going to talk to us about today about humanism and politics, and he has promised to throw in a few references to Charles Darwin to honour the occasion. Now, I want to give you a little bit of context about this talk. You may remember that on the 24th of August last year at the Elstead Hotel, we had an election for the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And we elected Cathy Silman as our next Humanist Prime Minister. And I'm absolutely certain that she would have lasted longer than Liz Truss. Anyway, Simon Whipple, who is our talks organiser, was intrigued by the question as to whether we can have such a thing as a humanist politics, which is why he invited Richard to address this topic. So we'll see what Richard comes up with. So please give Richard a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, all of you, for inviting me, and thank you for setting that exam question, which has got me thinking. And I do have an answer to the question, can humanist ethics produce a political programme? I've got an answer. It's the philosopher's answer. And my answer is, it depends what you mean by a political programme. I'm going to suggest that there is what I think can be called a humanist perspective on politics. There's a humanist approach, humanist political values. Whether they amount to a political programme, that's why you can decide for yourselves. I do think that the humanist tradition has always been linked with certain ethical ideas which do have political implications. I say the humanist tradition. The humanist tradition is not something that's sharply defined. In Europe, at least, we can trace it back to the ancient world. But modern humanism really starts to take shape with what we refer to as the 18th century Enlightenment, with, for example, those French thinkers whose ideas led to the French Revolution and the idea of the rights of man, which I'll come to in a moment. And one of the great representatives of those ideas in this country was Thomas Paine. And there he is. Paine, I think we can call Paine a humanist. He wasn't an atheist. He was what was called then a deist. That's to say, he believed in a sort of God, very different from the Christian God. Like many of his contemporaries, he was very impressed by Newtonian mechanics, and therefore saw the universe as one great machine, which, like any good machine, works like clockwork. It's therefore predictable. It can be understood by science. but like any machine, it must have a creator, some unknown creator, but after that, it works predictably and there's no place for divine intervention, for miracles or anything like that. So, although Paine is what we call a deist, his God is not a God that one can worship or pray to, and as Paine explicitly says, he has no church and doesn't believe in any institutional religion. This is how Paine himself puts it in his book, The Age of Reason. And I'll read it out. He says, "I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavouring to make our fellow creatures happy. I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish church, by the Roman church, by the Greek church, by the Turkish church, by the Protestant church, or by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church." That's a very humanist statement. And it's the starting point for Paine's politics, that idea, the belief in the equality of man, fundamental moral equality of all human beings, based on the fact of our common humanity. And this is how Paine, in his great political work, The Rights of Man, spells out the political implications. And again, I'll read it out. He says, "Every history of the creation and every traditionary account, however they may vary in their opinion or belief of certain particulars, all agree in establishing one point, the unity of man. By which I mean that man is all of one degree, and consequently that all men are born equal and with equal natural rights. The Mosaic account of the creation, whether taken as divine authority or merely historical, is fully up to this point, the unity or equality of man. The expressions admit of no controversy, and God said, 'Let us make man in our own image.'" And though Paine at that point refers to the religious account of the creation, I think it's pretty clear that he thinks that that idea of the unity of mankind and the equality of all human beings stands quite independently of any particular political creed. Paine's work, The Rights of Man, was a response to Edmund Burke's attack on the French Revolution. We'll come to Edmund Burke in a moment. But Burke was in particular attacking the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was the founding document of the French Revolution. And again, I'm going to read here the first 3 articles of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Article 1, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be based only on public utility." Sorry, I should have clicked that on. Article 2, "The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression." And Article 3, "The source of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body, no individual can exercise authority that does not explicitly proceed from it, from the people," that's to say. And Article 1 there, as in Paine, Article 1, the idea of the fundamental equality of all human beings, leads on to Article 3 and lays the basis for democracy. The Declaration doesn't actually use the language of democracy, nor indeed does Paine. Paine uses the word democracy to refer to the ancient Athenian system of direct democracy, government by the citizens assembled together. What Paine says he supports is a system of representation. That's the term he uses rather than democracy, a system of representation. And that's a term that's widely used by him and his successors, arguing for what we would now think of as democratic ideas. In England, those ideas predate Paine, and they begin to emerge especially in the 17th century, in the period of the Civil War and the Commonwealth. They came very much to the fore in the famous Putney debates, which took place in Putney Church in 1647, where the army got together, having succeeded in capturing Charles I. They discussed what should be the new political settlement, having got the king out of the way. Their debate is extremely interesting to read, and it was articulated primarily within a Christian framework, but it was a debate between those who were making the case for universal franchise, votes for everyone, and for, on the other side, a franchise limited to property owners. In the debate, Colonel Rainsborough, or Rainbow, it's variously spelt, was making the case for universal franchise in these words, very famous words. For really, he said, I think that the poorest he that is in England have the life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first, by his own consent, to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound, in a strict sense, to that government, that he hath not had a voice to put himself under. So there we see the transition from the idea of a fundamental human equality to the idea of equal rights, equal human rights, and from that to the idea of government by descent, at the heart of the idea of democracy. Since all human beings are equal and all have equal rights, no government can have authority over us unless we have consented to it. Rainsborough and other people who were arguing for that position were known as the Levellers. In the debate, they were opposed especially by Oliver Cromwell's son-in-law, General Ireton. Ireton, in opposition to Rainsborough, said, no person hath a right to an interest or share in the disposing of the affairs of the kingdom that hath not a permanent fixed interest in this kingdom. What he's in effect saying is, if you haven't got a stake in the country, if you don't have an interest in the future by owning property, then you shouldn't have a right to elect the government. So he's arguing against Rainsborough there. So that was in the middle of the 17th century then, and Paine at the end of the 18th century, Paine and others were taking forward the ideas of the Levellers, the idea of equal rights which are grounded in our common humanity and which mean that everyone should have a say in how they're governed. To see how revolutionary those ideas are, we need to contrast them with what had been the received ideas. The idea of the divine right of kings, for example. There you see King Charles getting his authority from above, from God. That was the idea common to Charles and his father, James I, who also defended the idea of the divine right of kings. And that idea, in turn, was part of a larger picture, which is essentially a hierarchical conception of society embedded within a hierarchical conception of the universe, what's sometimes referred to as the traditional Christian idea of the great chain of being, that, as it were, the whole universe, including human society, is layered, as it were, with God at the top, of course, below God, his angels, below the angels, human beings, but at the top of the scale of human beings are kings, and below them, presumably, are the nobility, and then the common people, ordinary mortals. And then, in turn, human beings have a natural authority over animals, over plants, and over inanimate things. And though it's not in that version, with that goes the idea that men have a natural and God-given authority over women, masters have a natural and God-given authority over slaves, and it's all part of that hierarchical picture of authority coming from above rather than authority coming from below. Now, by the 18th century, when Paine is writing and speaking, the opposition to democracy has changed. And as I said earlier, Paine writes The Rights of Man as an attack on Edmund Burke. And Burke explicitly rejects the idea of the divine right of kings. Burke's appeal is to the idea of tradition. It's tradition that should establish our political arrangements. As he says, it is with infinite caution that any man ought to venture upon pulling down an edifice which has answered in any tolerable degree for ages the common purposes of society. Burke doesn't reject the idea of human rights, but he thinks that what rights we have are simply a product of tradition built into what we inherit from our predecessors. As he puts it, an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers and to be transmitted to posterity. Now, there's nothing wrong with the idea of tradition in itself. I've talked already about the idea of a humanist tradition. There is such a thing. But for humanists, tradition is essentially a tradition of rational criticism. For Burke, in contrast, tradition, the idea of tradition is the idea of a divinely ordained natural order which we inherit from our forefathers and bequeath to those who come up after us. Giving his idea of his version of the idea of a social contract, Burke famously said the social contract is not just a contract made by us here and now to give consent to the government. This is how Burke puts it. The state is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and the invisible world according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath which holds all physical and moral natures, each in their appointed place. Note that last phrase, each in their appointed place. So tradition is something divinely ordained in which all of us, all human beings, all classes of society have their appointed place. In keeping with that idea, Burke defended the idea of an established church. I won't read at save time, I won't read out the whole quote, but defended the idea of a religious national establishment, as he put it. And he defended also the idea of the church control of education. The idea of church schools, our education, he says, is in the hands of ecclesiastics, and that's a great thing, he says. We'll come back to those sorts of ideas later. Burke's ideas that our society is part of a divinely ordained natural order of things in which each has their appointed place has an enduring appeal for at least a century after him. The idea, again, that hierarchy is natural. It's not the idea of the great chain of being, but it's another version based on the idea of tradition. And part of that idea is that the division between rich and poor is part of the natural order. We all have our appointed place in society. Famous articulation of that idea, which some of you may have sung, you know, the hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, which a lot of Christians are a bit embarrassed by these days because it includes the verse, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high or lowly and ordered their estate. So it's part of the divine order of things which we inherit by tradition, that there are rich and poor, and it's right that there should be so. Now, I said that Burke's ideas continue for a century or so, as represented by that hymn, and in the same way, the struggle for democracy and human rights, which people like Paine were at the beginning of, continued for the next 2 centuries in the form of campaigns for universal suffrage, the campaigns of people like the Chartists, the campaign for the Reform Act of 1867, and for many years after that. It's what people were protesting for in St. Peter's Fields in Manchester in 1819, when many people were massacred, mown down by the government troops. And it's an idea which the great humanist poet Shelley wrote about in his famous poem, The Mask of Anarchy. Some of you may know that Shelley, or rather Shelley's heart, is buried here in Bournemouth, in St. Peter's Churchyard in Bournemouth. And some of you may know why, and thereby hangs a tale. But Shelley's great poem, The Mask of Anarchy, is where he imagines the figure of unconstrained murder let loose, as at the Peterloo massacre, which he personifies as anarchy, to which lawyers and priests bow down. And they all cried with one accord, Thou art King and God and Lord. Anarchy, to thee we bow. Be thy name made holy now. And in that poem, Shelley, in very famous words, then imagines the spirit of hope arising out of the chaos and anarchy and massacre, and addressing the prostrate multitude, the people campaigning for universal suffrage and rights for all. Shelley famously wrote, Rise, like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep have fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. I hope you're all proud to have Shelley's heart in Bournemouth. Another very important dimension of those ideas of human equality, of the struggle for democracy and human rights, is the idea of the rights of women. And again, I think that's something at the heart of the humanist tradition. It's exemplified, for example, and at the same time as Paine, famously by Mary Wollstonecraft, who also is buried in Bournemouth. Indeed, she's buried in the same grave as Shelley's heart, and thereby it hangs a tale, which is a tale maybe that many of you know. We won't go into the details now. But Mary Wollstonecraft responded to Burke earlier than Paine did, actually. She published her Vindication of the Rights of Men, her answer to Burke, in 1790, a year before Paine. And she followed it up more famously in 1792 with her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she argues that human equality is grounded in our shared possession of reason. All human beings possess the capacity for reason, and that's what makes us all equal. She says, in what does man's preeminence over the brute creation consist? The answer is as clear as that a half is less than the whole, in reason. From the exercise of reason, knowledge and virtue naturally flow. She's challenging the idea, of course, that women are less fully endowed with reason than men are. And she answers that by saying that if women appear to exercise reason less, that's because it's a situation that's self-perpetuating. Men claim that women possess less reason, and so they deny them the opportunity to develop it. Women are denied the same education as men. Women are denied the same opportunities as men. They're treated, she says, as silly and superficial beings whose object in life is simply to please men, to attract a husband, and then to keep that husband happy and to administer to his wants. This is how, in what I think is a lovely passage, she describes the way in which women are kept uneducated and unable to exercise their reason. The very constitution, she says, the very constitution of civil government has put almost insuperable obstacles in the way to prevent the cultivation of the female understanding. Yet, virtue can be built on no other foundation. Pleasure is the business of women's life, according to the present modification of society, and while it continues to be so, little can be expected of such weak beings, weak in inverted commas, of course. They have to maintain their power, resigned the natural rights which the exercise of reason might have procured them, and chosen to be rather the short-lived queens than labour to obtain the sober pleasures that arise from equality. Confined then in cages like the feathered race, like caged birds in other words, they have nothing to do but to plume themselves and stalk with mock majesty from perch to perch. She's saying that's not the natural condition of women, that's what women are reduced to by their role in society. And that's why at the end of her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, she has some very radical ideas about the importance of education, and in particular the importance of education equally for boys and for girls. She has some very radical proposals for girls and boys to be taught together in publicly funded schools in a national system of education. Quite revolutionary ideas for their day. An equivalent defence of women's rights can be found very similarly in the writings of a French Enlightenment thinker and humanist, Nicolas de Condorcet, I hope I pronounced that correctly. A French Enlightenment thinker who was a very active participant in the French Revolution. Just before Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication, he wrote a pamphlet on giving women the right of citizenship as part of his contribution to the debates taking place in the French Revolution. He wrote, and I quote, "The rights of men stem exclusively from the fact that they are sentient beings capable of acquiring moral ideas and of reasoning upon them. Since women have the same qualities, they necessarily also have the same rights. Either no member of the human race has any true rights, or else they all have the same ones. And anyone who votes against the rights of another, whatever his religion, colour or sex, automatically forfeits his own." So that's the same idea that we saw in Paine and in Wollstonecraft, the idea that our common humanity is rooted in our shared possession of reason, and that's what gives us equal rights and therefore should give us equal political rights. And since the time of Wollstonecraft and Condorcet, that struggle for political rights in general, and especially women's political rights and women's equality, has been inseparable from the humanist movement. Some of you may be familiar with the terrific information online in the Humanist Heritage website, devised by Maddie Goodall, who's done some fantastic work for Humanists UK on assembling that. And she's got a lot of really fascinating information about the role of humanist women in the humanist movement, who are also active in the campaign for women's suffrage and women's rights. Condorcet, to refer back to him, was one of the first to recognise also that belief in human equality is not only a belief in sexual equality, but also a direct challenge to racial oppression, and especially a challenge to slavery and the slave trade, which still then existed, of course. Condorcet helped to found an anti-slavery society, which was called the Society for the Friends of the Negro, and he wrote the rules for that society. That's what he wrote. "It is not just a small group of people that we are trying to help, but an entire race, part of the world crushed beneath the weight of its change, cries out to us for restoration of its sacred human rights." And so you can see there again how radical these humanist ideas were at the time, in people like Paine and Wollstonecraft and Condorcet. Continuing that theme of a commitment in the humanist tradition to the promotion of human rights, more recently, humanists have, of course, been at the forefront of the movement for gay rights. So back in the 1950s, for example, many prominent humanists, such as A.J. Ayer and Julian Huxley and Bertrand Russell, were among the founders of the Homosexual Law Reform Society in 1958, which eventually achieved a change in the law with the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. E.M. Forster, the humanist who was the famous author, made a large, though he shunned the limelight, was very reluctant to go public on these things, but he made a large donation to the Homosexual Law Reform Society. Subsequently, because of course the 1967 Act was only a partial legalisation, subsequently the Gay Humanist Group was founded in 1979, which became the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association, GALA, it was abbreviated to, in 1987, and is now known as the LGBT Humanists. And that campaign again, and that tradition is a direct expression of the humanist commitment to human rights. As I've said, E.M. Forster, the famous novelist, was not exactly a campaigner, but he was an iconic figure for humanists and for supporters of gay rights. And he was very prominent of the humanist movement. He was the vice president of the British Humanist Association. I think he was also the chair of Cambridge Humanists. His novel, Maurice, is English. Maurice was published posthumously in 1971 as a depiction of homosexual love. And that picture there is a portrait of Forster, which was painted by his cousin Philip Wichlow and donated to GALA, what's now LGBT Humanists, and it was presented at Conway Hall, and that portrait can still be seen there today. So, I think there is a humanist politics, and I think it consists in a commitment to human equality, for working for human rights and for democracy. I noticed on your pop-up banner here that you begin by saying humanism is a democratic and ethical life stance. I'm very pleased that you have the word democratic in there, which not all humanist groups, I think, would forefront in that kind of way, but I think it's absolutely right. Now, of course, that commitment to working for human rights and democracy is not obviously exclusively humanist. Obviously, for example, in the case of the campaign against slavery in the slave trade, Christians such as Thomas Clarkson, the Quaker, and the evangelical Anglican William Wilberforce were at the forefront of that campaign in Britain, as Condorcet was in France. Again, campaigns for democratic suffrage, such as the Chartists, had close links, many of them, with dissenting Christians and nonconformist churches. And again, on the subject of campaigning for gay rights, there have been brave Christians within the churches who have worked for women's rights and gay rights, and in some of the churches they've still got a way to go, as we've seen this week. It's a struggle that's transparently not yet complete. So I'm not making a historical claim here that humanists have been the only people working for democracy and human rights, and they've done it alone. I wouldn't make any such claim, of course, and indeed my claim is not primarily a historical claim at all. What I'm saying is that in answer to the question in my title, yes, humanist ethics can produce a humanist politics. And it's a politics of human rights and democracy which is rooted in humanist values of our common humanity and the equality of all human beings. Is that a political programme? Well, it certainly was in 1790, when people like Paine and Wollstonecraft and Condorcet were writing and thinking. But of course, what's also striking is that those political values, in this country at least, and in theory at least, have become mainstream. They've become common ground across the spectrum of British politics. Very few people in the political arena now, compared with, say, 150 years ago, very few people in the political arena are going to say, at least in public, that they don't agree with democracy. And although the current government is wanting to repeal the Human Rights Act, they're not saying, oh, we don't agree with human rights. They say we want our own bill, not that European thing, although of course it isn't a European thing, it predates the European Union. But at any rate, the political agenda of people like Tom Paine has been achieved in a way that might have seemed remarkable to them at the time. If Paine could see where we've got to now, I think he would feel a certain pride in what has been achieved. So because the ideas of a politics of democracy and human rights have become mainstream, they cut across the main political divide in British politics. Conservatism in this country has changed radically since the days of Edmund Burke. The primary division now between left and right in politics is on who can deliver the goods. So got some portrayals of the left and right in 1790 with Burke and Paine, and then two familiar figures from a relatively recent past as representing the left and right in British politics now. And they, like the left and right generally in British politics now, well, of course, would say, of course we're in favour of democracy, of course we're in favour of human rights. And the big division now is between those who think that it's the market economy that can deliver the goods, and those who think that we need social provision to deliver the goods. And though what divides them are competing factual claims about what will do it, but they will all acknowledge, yes, of course, we need an economy that works for everyone. They wouldn't defend the idea, well, so it's right that society should be divided between rich and poor. The advocates of the market economy will argue that though it makes some people very rich, the trickle-down effect means that everybody in the long term will benefit. And against them are those who say that the trickle-down effect doesn't work, that poverty has to be tackled directly by increased public funding from taxation for things like health and education and public services and so on. But neither side in modern British politics is going to say, at least say explicitly, that we shouldn't tackle poverty, that it's part of the natural order of things, as Burke would have said. But the difference between them is an empirical question, a factual question of what's the best way of meeting everyone's needs. As humanists, of course, we should insist on an evidence-based approach to that, looking rationally and objectively at the evidence. But it seems to me that a humanist could consistently take either side in that debate. And I think humanist organisations rightly are neutral on the party political divide in this country at the moment. Now, that's not to say that we should be complacent about the politics of democracy and human rights. Across the world, those things are constantly under threat, as we know all too well. In many parts of the world, they're non-existent. If you think of countries like Afghanistan and where are human rights and democracy there? Humanists International and Humanists UK rightly campaign for rights to free expression and freedom of religion and belief across the world. Think of the situation in Nigeria, for example, where the president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria has been imprisoned on a charge of blasphemy. Think of the way in which in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, if you say you're a humanist, you risk your life. Standing up for those rights, those basic human rights grounded in our common humanity, is an essential part of a humanist political agenda, and it still needs our continuing commitment and our continuing action. Closer to home, the rise of authoritarian populism and extreme nationalism is a reminder that the struggle for democracy, the struggle for human rights, is never complete. Just think across the Atlantic and think of the unholy alliance between Donald Trump and the evangelical right in the United States. Or think of the way in which the demonization of immigrant communities leads to forms of racism and attacks on the rights of minorities in this country and in America and in other parts of Europe. Think of the attacks on gay rights in some of the countries of Eastern Europe. Humanists have to defend those rights, although I've said that those humanist political values have become mainstream. They're never secure. They always have to be worked for. They always have to be campaigned for and defended. And many of Humanists UK campaigns are a part of that political agenda of human rights. Campaigns, for example, for abortion rights, for assisted dying, and other basic human rights. There's another strand of humanist campaigning that I think fits within that same perspective, within the framework of democracy and human rights, and that's the campaigning for secularism, by which I mean the separation of church and state, the separation of religious institutions and political institutions. Think back to Burke again, and Burke's enthusiastic support for the idea of a church establishment. That's something that, of course, that humanists radically reject. Reject not just because we reject organised religion. Religious organisations have a perfect right to exist. What, as humanists, we reject is the idea that religious organisations should have a privileged position in the life of our society. It's contrary to the idea of equal rights, and so the politics of secularism is an essential part of a humanist political programme. It'll no doubt not have escaped your notice that we've got a coronation coming up shortly. That will, of course, be a Church of England service in Westminster Abbey to inaugurate the reign of the new monarch. An event that will symbolise the privileged status of the Christian religion. You might say, well, it's just symbolic, we can live with that, but it goes deeper than that, of course. You've probably seen Sandy Toxig's petition that she's just launched with the support of Humanists UK and the NSS, using that occasion for a petition against the presence of 26 bishops as members of the House of Lords as of right. A clearly undemocratic state of affairs, which means that members of the Church of England have a greater representation in political decision making than those who are not. And another important element of the humanist secularist programme, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the opposition to religious schools. Remember, 1/3 of state-funded schools in England are religious schools, and the vast majority of those, 98% of those, are either Church of England schools or Roman Catholic schools. There are many grounds for criticising the institution of religious schools, and there isn't time to go into all the different grounds now to do with social cohesion and the like, but the one that I'm focusing on now is the recognition that it's contrary to the principle of a democratic society based on equal rights of all citizens, that religious organisations should have a privileged position in the education system of this country. In a democratic society, no section of society should have a privileged status because of the religious beliefs that it stands for. So, to summarise my case so far, I've been suggesting there is a humanist politics, something that we can call a humanist politics, I think, and it's essentially a politics of democracy and human rights. As I've said, that may sound uncontentious, not very startling, pretty mainstream, but the fact that it is now mainstream is an achievement to be celebrated, an achievement of, amongst others, the humanist movement and the humanist tradition. I've said that there's still a lot to do to defend that humanist politics, to extend it in this country and even more worldwide. And I've suggested that in this country that means also advocating the politics of secularism. So that's my case so far. And in conclusion, I want to make, perhaps slightly more controversially, but let's see what you think. In conclusion, I want to make a case for what I think should be one other dimension of humanist politics, and that's environmental politics. Now, again, of course, campaigning on the environment is not something that's uniquely humanist. But I think it's important that we should add a humanist voice to that huge task of tackling our twin environmental crises, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. Some of you will know that we've recently set up a new section of Humanist UK, which is Humanist Climate Action, which I've been involved in. We've set it up because we think we need to show publicly that humanists are as committed to action on the environment as anybody else is. And also because we need to mobilise humanists to take action in view of the sheer urgency of the environmental crises and the huge threats that they pose for the future of humanity. We know that average temperatures across the globe continue to rise. We know that the polar ice caps are melting. We know that the glaciers are melting. We know that the oceans are warming. We know that the global warming is likely to increase the frequency of extreme weather conditions, and that if that continues, then it is likely to have devastating consequences to render parts of the world uninhabitable, to lead to mass migration and to global conflict. There is strong evidence, I don't put it any harder than that, but strong evidence that these developments, these changes in the climate, are largely the result of human activity and the continuing humanist production of carbon emissions. We know also that species are declining at an alarming rate, and we know that that's largely a consequence of the human impact on the habitats of other plants and other animals and plants. And again, that is likely to have, if we don't reverse it, devastating consequences. To take an obvious case, the decline in insect populations as a result of insecticides and pesticides will lead to a decline in pollinators, and as a result, fruit crops, example, will fail. And also those two crises, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, are closely linked. The biodiversity crisis is in part a consequence of the effects of global warming, and conversely, one of the most important ways of tackling the climate crisis is by protecting the natural environment, more green spaces, more trees to absorb carbon emissions. So they're closely linked, and they require political action to develop new energy sources, new modes of transport, new agricultural practices, and effective international agreements. Now, all of that's familiar, I think. Why should humanists get involved? Well, I want to suggest two reasons why that work is of special relevance for humanists. First of all, because it's absolutely essential, as I've tried to indicate, in tackling those problems, it's essential to follow the science. As I'm sure you know, a central strand of humanist thought has always been that scientific method is our best bet for understanding the natural world. It's scientific evidence that identifies the likely causes of global warming and of species decline. That doesn't mean that we should just accept uncritically everything that the scientists say. It's an essential feature of scientific method that there is no final certainty. That it's important that established ideas are tested, all theories are treated as falsifiable. It's important always to look for counter-evidence and to challenge the established theories. And so those of us who are not scientists should not bow down before the scientists and treat them as an infallible authority. But we should, as humanists, take very seriously the scientific consensus on the explanations for global warming and the explanations for species decline. We should look at the reasons scientists give, look at the correlations they establish between, for example, carbon emissions and rising temperatures, and the model that they put forward that explains that. So that's the first of my two reasons why I think that this work has a special relevance for humanists. And the second I want to suggest is a recognition which, again, should be at the heart of humanism, that human beings are a part of the natural world. That's a view that contrasts with the idea that the human species is a special creation, that human beings are made in the image of God, that human beings are the purpose for which the rest of the universe exists. We know human species are the product of an evolutionary process, and have emerged in the same way as other species. As such, we're dependent on the rest of the natural world. As such, how human societies organise themselves inevitably has an impact on the rest of the natural world. We're not set apart, we're not immune. If we act destructively, therefore, we perish along with other creatures in the natural world. So we have to learn to live in harmony with nature, not in some mystical sense, but by recognising the hard facts of our interdependence with the natural world. So I've said that as humanists, we emphasise the idea that human beings are an integral part of the natural world. And the great breakthrough in the understanding of how human beings are a part of the natural world came, of course, with Darwin, and we come now to Darwin, whose birthday tomorrow we celebrate today. Charles Darwin, to whom I like to think I have a certain resemblance, especially when I let my beard grow. In case you're unsure, it's Charles Darwin on the left and me on the right. That's me standing underneath a memorial to Charles Darwin on the wall of the church in Down, which is the village where he lived. In his first famous work, The Origin of Species, Darwin rather carefully didn't discuss, other than just hinting at, the origin of the human species. But he tackled that question directly in the work that he published in 1871, so that's 12 years later, The Descent of Man. There he explicitly shows that the human species, the emergence of the human species is continuous with the emergence of other species. And he tries to answer the argument that the differences between humans and other species are so great that the gap couldn't possibly be bridged by a gradual evolutionary process. And in that work, in a fascinating way, Darwin catalogues in detail the many similarities between human and animal behaviour, the way in which we share with other animals qualities such as love and jealousy, the exercise of memory, the capacity for imitation, the exercise of imagination, the use of tools. The Descent of Man was a book of its time, it has to be said. And one of the arguments that Darwin deploys there is an appeal to what he refers to as the differences between the so-called races of man. He argues that if we look at primitive societies, as they were called, we can see that they are closer to our pre-human ancestors. Darwin was certainly not immune to the prejudices of his time. But what carries the weight of his argument then is his exhaustive observation of non-human animal behaviour and the continuities between the behaviour of humans and the behaviour of other animals, to establish that we are part of the natural world and a product of the natural process of evolution, like all other species. The concept of ecosystems, which features so much in arguments about biodiversity, we should notice is central to the whole theory of natural selection. Think of Darwin's Galapagos finches, on his voyage around the world, the voyage of the Beagle. Darwin spent time in the Galapagos Islands. He hadn't yet formulated the theory of natural selection, but thinking about the differences between the finches on different islands led him to think about the idea of their having a common ancestor. The finches differ mainly in the size and shape of their beaks, and he came to think that these were mutations, genetic mutations, which have conferred an advantage in specific environments, where on different islands there are different foods that the finches feed from. Seeds on some islands, insects or fruits. That's what gave rise to the whole theory of natural selection, the idea that evolution takes place in particular ecosystems where mutations confer in that environment a particular advantage. The human species likewise evolved in a specific environment. The mutations such as the physiological changes that are conducive to our walking upright assisted in the survival in a specific environment, maybe the African savanna at a time when the tree line was receding. I don't think we know for certain. But we evolved within a particular ecosystem. And the problem now, of course, is that human beings, having evolved within a specific environment, have been able to move away, way beyond that environment. And we act as though we can dominate the whole of nature with impunity. And in the process, we're destroying it. And perhaps we need to relearn to adapt in order to survive. I put the need for a scientifically informed environmental politics at the heart of humanist politics, and I put it in terms, so far, of the imperative of human survival. But it's not just that, I think, which should motivate us. I think in caring for the environment, we should also be motivated by a sense of the wonder and beauty of the natural world as something that enriches our lives, but makes life worth living. And I want to end by quoting that very fine passage at the end of Darwin's Origin of Species, where he expresses that sense of the wonder and beauty of the natural world. And I'll quote it in conclusion. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Darwin famously concludes, there is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. I don't know if this is working at the moment. Maybe Phil will... okay, it's just coming on, yeah. Thank you, Richard. Beautifully weaving in Darwin there towards the end of your talk. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we're going to take a little break.